Um, the first question I want to ask, and with everything that you do and as busy as you are, why get involved with October the 7th and why the book?
Yeah, that's a good question. Can everyone hear me if I speak like this? Yeah. Okay. The thing that really radicalized me, I guess, if we can use that word, was actually October the 8th rather than October the 7th, because October the 7th, what happened on that day was obviously historically horrific, the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. But for many of us, even though it was shocking, it wasn't necessarily surprising, because we always suspected that Hamas was an army of anti-Semites, a fascist army that posed as a national liberation movement. So we were aware of what Hamas was capable of and what it wanted to do. So it was horrific, but it wasn't necessarily that surprising that Hamas would do something so depraved. But what really shook me to my core, even more than 7th of October itself, was 8th of October, because on that day, I don't know if you remember, but people gathered outside the Israeli embassy in London and celebrated. They let off fireworks, they played pop music, they danced in the streets, they burnt the Israeli flag. The same thing happened on 8th of October in Sydney. People gathered outside the Sydney Opera House and chanted, "Fuck the Jews, gas the Jews." The same thing happened in Berlin. People gathered in central Berlin and danced and sang and played music. And I remember watching these events thinking, this is really, really harrowing to see this in the city in which I live, other cities that I visited, in what I consider to be the civilized West, to see people celebrating the mass murder of Jews and the rape of Jewish women and the killing of Jewish children. And I say in my book, it would be as horrific as if people had poured onto the streets of London in 1938 to celebrate Kristallnacht. And we would remember if people had done that. It would be in the history books. It would be part of our common knowledge. So we ought to remember that they did it for the 7th of October. We ought to remember that the response of this kind of unholy marriage of affluent socialists and radical Islamists was to celebrate the worst act of anti-Jewish violence since the Holocaust. So it was really the 8th of October that radicalized me on this question. I've been writing about Israel for years and years. I've been pro-Israel for a long time. I've got a lot of flack for that over the years, including from old friends of mine. But after 7th of October, I just thought this is an issue I need to write about in more depth, and I need to get it off my chest. Because the other thing that I found after 7th of October, I was getting very angry about these protests, these pro-Palestine protests. I cycle everywhere in London, and almost every day I would cycle past some kind of protest against Israel. A big one or a small one, or people protesting outside Marks and Spencer's because they're anti-Semitic and they don't think you should shop in Jewish-owned shops. And I found myself shouting at people all the time. Like, I would get off my bike and walk past these crowds of people, and I would chant, "F Hamas, victory, victory to Israel." And I was like a one-man counter-protest for the weeks and months after 7th of October. And I thought, this is probably not good for my mental health. And at some point, someone's going to film me and put it on YouTube, which would be even worse. So I thought I just have to write it down. I have to get my thoughts down on paper. And then I wrote the book, and it came out on the first anniversary of 7th of October. So 7th of October last year.
And did you get much professional pushback?
Some, yeah. I get called, like anyone who stands up for Israel, you get called racist. You get called an anti-Arab racist. I cycled past a demonstration in Westminster fairly recently, and I did my usual thing of getting off my bike and shouting at people. And an old man hit me with his walking stick, and a gang of young fellas in keffiyehs started pushing me onto the road. And they called me the C word, and they called me racist. And I said, hold on, I'm criticizing Hamas, who in my mind are a racist army. They were founded with the express intention of killing Jews and destroying the Jewish homeland. And yet you're calling me racist, even though you're on the streets supporting them, and I'm here trying to put the other point of view. So you get pushback from all sorts of quarters. I have found that when I do BBC debates over the past 2 years on radio or TV, they treat you like a leper. You are a moral leper if you go on the BBC and say Israel is great. Israel's a good country. It has every right to fight back against these lunatics on its borders. It has every right to bomb Iran. If you say things like that, they look at you as if you are insane. Whereas, of course, I think the BBC is insane because it works with journalists at BBC Arabic who say that we should kill the Jews. And it told so many lies about the Israel-Hamas war over the past 2 years that it had to issue, on average, 2 corrections a week, every week, since 7th of October. That's how many lies it's told about the Jewish state. So obviously I think they're insane. But I have noticed, even in journalism circles, there are some journalists who are very good on this issue, people like Douglas Murray, Natasha Horsdorf, people like this who I think are just such beacons of moral clarity. But then there are lots of people who go with the general fashionable opinion. And sadly, one of the luxury beliefs of our time is that Israel is a wicked nation. And I think challenging that luxury belief is really important.
I think that's something that as an organisation we find weekly, that the misinformation that's passed out to the general public. And you quote the BBC, and I think the Sky and probably other media outlets are just as guilty of that. Probably the BBC more, to be fair. It's interesting. Jake Wallace-Simon said about the book, "A bruising blow in the cause of liberty, tolerance and good sense. Thank God he's on our side." And Elon Levy, "A brutally honest analysis of how the world failed the test of Hamas's brutality." So I guess the other question I wanted to ask actually is why the title is, I just spoke to my son who lives in Israel, and he said, I need to know why he called it the pogrom. Why did he use the word pogrom? And maybe explain why, because the pogrom for him, for certain, for a lot of people, it has an association with, let's say, Russia, for whatever it may be. Why did you choose the word pogrom, if I may ask?
I actually used that word on the day itself, on 7th of October itself, 2023. Someone asked, the editor of Spike, Tom Slater, asked me to write a piece as the event was unfolding. And at the time, the death toll was 20 people, or the known death toll was 20 people. So I thought, God, this is really serious. 20 people have been killed. Turned out, obviously, to be much, much worse. So I wrote a piece, and in the speech, you can see that it says 20 people have been killed. And in that piece, I called it a pogrom against Israel, because I had a feeling that we were seeing something really, really bad. Not just, Hamas have been firing missiles at Israel forever, and Hezbollah does it all the time, and Iran occasionally takes action against Israel. So those kinds of things happen all the time. But I had a feeling that what we were seeing was something worse. Something that I felt fell outside the bounds of normal anti-Israel activity. Outside the bounds of missiles being fired at the Jewish nation, or suicide bombings on buses, all those horrible things that have happened for years and years. And I wanted to try and capture a sense that this was it felt like a historic crime was unfolding before our eyes. And then as more and more information came in, it's very clear that that's what happened. And I just think that all of the words that are used to describe 7th of October feel insufficient. So some people, obviously the anti-Semitic left calls it an act of resistance because they're anti-Semitic. So they think killing Jews is an act of resistance. Other people call it terrorism, which I also feel doesn't quite capture the nature of it. Other people call it mass murder. The BBC calls it the 7th of October attacks because it can't bring itself to refer to Hamas as terrorists. And I just feel that all of those didn't quite capture the nature of what we saw, which was, in my mind, one of the most violent tears in civilization itself of my lifetime. In a very long time, it felt like it was something that was even worse than terrorism, even worse than mass murder. It was the intimacy of it, the fact that people went into Israel to carry out with their own hands these acts of barbarism, and the fact that they filmed it. They filmed it, they put it online, they wanted other anti-Semites to watch it and enjoy it. So it felt like we were watching something that we really hadn't seen since the Nazi era, and I wanted to capture that by using the word pogrom.
So talk me through, or talk us through more correctly, your memories of October the 7th. maybe even through to October the 8th. When did you first hear what was occurring, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, on the 7th of October 2023, I was taking my nephews to the cinema. And as we were on our way there, someone messaged me saying, "Have you seen what's happening?" Because I write about Israel quite a lot, even before 7th of October. And then I looked it up, I watched the news, and then I had to write this piece very, very quickly with my nephews kind of tapping me on the shoulder saying, "Come on, the film's starting." So that was the day itself, and then I watched this film, and then it came out of the cinema 2 hours later and realized that the death toll was, even by that point, was already in the hundreds. So it was a weird, shocking day. And I knew the response in the West was going to be bad. I mean, anti-Israel sentiment is very pronounced in Western societies, especially in left-wing circles, liberal circles, media circles. So I knew the response would be apologetic. I knew people would say, "Well, what do you expect? Israel's a bad country." I knew all that would happen, but it was so much worse than even I had anticipated. And when I saw those celebrations at the Israeli embassy 24 hours later, I was horrified.
And this is obviously before Israel retaliated.
Yeah, and if you look at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, they applied for the right to march against Israel while 7th of October was still happening, like 3 p.m. or something on 7th of October, while people were still being killed, while women were still being raped. They were applying for the right to march in London against Israel, which we didn't discover till a few months later, but it was off a piece with the response to 7th of October, which was instantly to think, well, Israel brought this on itself. That's the kind of discussion I was seeing. And I was in Israel just a few weeks ago, and I visited some of the kibbutzim that were attacked, and the Nova Music Festival site and places like that. And I mean, nothing can prepare you for the stories that you hear. It's even worse than we might think. And especially when you go, I was in Kibbutz Be'eri, where 120 people were killed. This is a community of 1,200 people. So that's literally a decimation, the killing of 1 in 10, a biblical assault on a Jewish community. And this is a Jewish community of socialists and farmers, collectivists. These are people who consider themselves left-wing, who have Palestinians coming over from Gaza every day, working on the avocado farms and in the printing press. These are progressive communities that reject capitalism and do everything through the democratic mechanism. And yet you have leftists in the West for whom being left-wing means having blue hair and thinking that a man can become a woman. Not always. It's not always bad. It's not always bad to have blue hair. And you had leftists like that celebrating the killing of these leftists, celebrating their murder in their fields, on their farms. An old couple were killed under a tree because they were just sitting outside relaxing. And when you visit a place like that and you see the blackened buildings and you see the smoke marks where the Hamas smoked out the Jews in order that they could kill them. And when you hear the stories of the people who survived, and one of the young men who showed me around, his brother was killed, and you talk to people like that, you realize it's even more horrific than you thought. And it really was, to my mind, we've seen a lot of bad terrorism over the past 20 years, 9/11, 7/7, the Manchester Arena bombing, so many atrocities, but there was something about this, the racism in it, the intimacy of it, the closeness of, the guy who phoned his mother or father and boasted about killing 10 Jews. That kind of thing we haven't seen in a generation or 2 generations. So that's why I felt compelled to write about it, to talk about it, and just to say as much as I can in defense of Israel and against these barbarians who everyone else is celebrating.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when we do our outreach, one of the questions we ask people quite often is, well, how did this start? When did this start? And a lot of people don't actually know about October the 7th. It's almost been dismissed. It's almost been removed from history, but for a lot of people. And I think, we're very fortunate. We do a lot of, as I say, outreach. It's impacted on the Jewish community massively. But actually, if you scan the room now, and if you look at the support that we get as an organisation, it's cross-communal. And I think that for us as a community is pretty reassuring as well, that it's not just us that are impacted upon. everybody who wants to be, from my perspective, on the right side of history is echoing exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's about hoping we're on the right side of history. I'm pretty sure we are, but you never quite know until history makes its judgment, which can take a very, very long time. And, I meet people all the time who tell me I'm on the wrong side of history. I do media debates and they say, you're on the wrong side of history. You're supporting the new Nazism, etc., etc. They think they're on the right side of history because they hate Israel. They think the Jews should shut the hell up and stop whining. They think Hamas has got a justified cause to do what it did. And the point I always make to them is history's judgment has a habit of surprising us. All those Nazis thought they were on the right side of history. I'm not saying that to be flippant. They genuinely thought they were doing the Lord's work. They really thought they were saving humanity. That was what propelled them. They really genuinely believed that. The Inquisition, the leaders of the Inquisition thought they were on the right side of history when they killed Jews or killed witches or whatever else it might be. They really thought they were saving humankind from this kind of moral pollution. And, lo and behold, 50 years later, maybe 100 years later, however long it might take, history's judgment suddenly switches and they find that they were actually the bad guys. I genuinely believe that's going to happen on this issue. I really fervently believe, and I don't know how long it will take, it might be 5, 10, 50 years. I do honestly believe that future historians will look back on this period and they will wonder how so-called progressives took the side of an army of anti-Semitic barbarians. I genuinely think that's what future historians will ask. I think they will ask other questions as well, like, why did we give double mastectomies to young lesbians in the belief that it would turn them into men? I genuinely believe these questions will be asked of the moment in which we live. And therefore, it's incumbent on all of us to do what we think is right in this moment, not because we hope that people in the future, when we're dead, will say we were the good guys, although that's nice if they do say that, but in order just to put a flag of sanity up in this era of madness and say there are some of us here now in this moment. We don't have to wait for the judgment of history because we feel it right now, who want to say the right thing. And one of the right things we can say is, and I've got in trouble for saying this before, but I'm going to say it again anyway, which is, not only is Israel's war in Gaza not a genocide, which I think most people in this room would probably agree with, but not only is it not a genocide, it's a heroic war. Of course, it's horrible and bloody and tragic, and lots of people are dying. That's what happens in all wars. That's why war is a bad thing. That's why people shouldn't start wars, as Hamas did on 7th of October. But what the IDF is doing is heroic. They are standing up for the future of the Jewish homeland. They are defending, I think, the values of Western civilization itself. They are seeking to take down and having great success in taking down the enemies of civilization who threaten us in the West as much as they do Jews in the Middle East. They're taking down Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran. These are people who sponsor terrorism not only in that region, but also across the Western world. They're trying to take down the kind of people who happily blew up 22 teenagers and kids at Manchester Arena in 2017. If you're trying to take those people down, I'm on your side. That's all there is to it. And I think we've got to be, I'm not saying anyone in this room is like this, but I've met people like this who are quite apologetic about their support for Israel. They will always clear their throat and saying, well, yeah, it's bad news, and Netanyahu's a bad guy, but, Israel's got to, whatever. No more throat clearing. Israel has absolutely a fundamental right to destroy the armies that invaded it. And if we had any sense left in the West, we would recognize that what it was doing was good and positive and a benefit for humanity. And I think we just got to say that much more loudly and proudly, I think.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think what we'll do now is open the floor to a few questions. So, Michelle, if I can borrow you for 2 minutes, it's going to take that.
I haven't heard the Trump word yet. So I'm just wondering what your views were on what Trump's doing and his response to what's going on.
Should I come back on? Yeah.
Yeah. And then we'll go.
Yeah. I love Donald Trump. I don't agree with him on many, many, many things. I think he's very funny. And also, I think there's a logic to his policy program, whether one agrees with it or not, which is about reining in the American empire and reshoring American industry in order to benefit working class communities in America and save them from the deaths of despair and the fentanyl crisis and all these other things that followed directly from the outsourcing of American industry to other countries. There's a logic to what he does. Some of it I agree with, some of it I don't agree with, but I was beyond happy when he was re-elected, because it was proof, in my view, that there are still millions and millions of working class people out there who are looking for something different to the establishment, which is why I think Reform will do very well in our next general election, and I'll be very happy about that as well. In relation to the Middle East, I think Trump's good and bad. He's good because he's definitely more in favor of Israel's war on Hamas than Joe Biden was, or Kamala Harris. Who they were both too flighty and too easily led by kind of mobs of Israelophobic students and radicals and posh people. He's a bit firmer, but he is sometimes, I think, he sometimes allows his temper to get ahead of him. I don't think he should criticize Israel publicly, which he has done a few times. I think that's bad diplomacy and not what you do with an ally. With a friend, with a friendly state. So I think he's made some mistakes. But generally speaking, I think he's done some good things, some positive things. I don't think those hostages would be home if the Democrats had been, if we had President Harris. They would not be home. And in fact, some of them would be dead. And that's something really worth thinking about and celebrating. Trump, I think, can definitely be thanked for that. So I think in the round, his contribution to Israel's future has been positive, and his contribution to Western politics has been positive. And I say that as someone who probably would argue with him constantly if I ever went for a drink with him. But, you know, we need figures like this to shake up political life, I think.
Thank you. So you spoke about the sudden... I'm sorry. I had it all planned in my head and now it's gone. The demonstrations at the Israeli embassy in Sydney and Berlin, etc., on the 8th of October. You then reminded us that the PSC had applied for permission to march at 3 o'clock on the 7th of October. Do you think that these were spontaneous demonstrations, or could they have been planned?
Yeah, that's a good question. I often get asked, who do you think is supporting these demonstrations? Who's funding them? Who's behind them? And I think that's an interesting question when people ask me who's behind these demonstrations, who's given them money, etc., who's producing their fancy placards. It's a question worth asking. And Qatar definitely has a problematic influence in the Western world through universities and so on. But I think actually the real tragedy is that a lot of it is spontaneous. The real tragedy is there are a lot of people in the West who have this instinctive animus towards Israel. And I think sometimes we are a bit reluctant to face up to that. So we think to ourselves, who's behind it? Who's puppeteering this? Who's the cause of this? When I think actually one of the arguments I make in my book is that the cause of it is the West's own turn against its civilizational values. And that's been happening on Western campuses for a long time. Students now go to university as kind of bright-eyed, interested kids, and they come out as these kind of robots who hate the West and think everyone's racist and whatever. You know, they are young people, when they say to me, should I go to university? I increasingly say no. If you're good at something, then get a trade, learn a trade, get a job. That would be much more fruitful both for you and for society. You know, through the universities, through the school system, in popular culture, amongst the political class, there is this growing turn against the West, against our own civilization. We're encouraged to see British history as just a litany of crimes against humanity. We're encouraged to say, take this statue down because that was not a good guy, or rename this street, or, you know, we're told to have this shamefaced approach to British history. I was on a BBC radio discussion about statues recently, and they said, well, you're from an Irish background. Surely you want the statue of Cromwell taken down from Parliament Square. And I was like, no, why on earth would I want, the revolutionary founder of modern parliamentary democracy to be torn down from Parliament Square just because he killed some Irish people 400 years ago? It's ludicrous. But that is the kind of temperature of the culture in which we live. We are constantly led by the nose into this kind of hateful, anti-Western, self-flagellating culture. So I think a lot of the stuff we saw on 8th of October was a physical manifestation of that. It was the kind of the wages of the West's own hatred for itself being played out in this real way on the streets. So I think we've got to do a real reckoning with ourselves and our own society and our own education system if we're going to get to the root of this problem, I think.
Okay. Brendan, thanks for coming. I'm a big fan. I've been a big fan for many years, a top fan, you might say. But, you talked about history and history judging people. And history, I think, has judged Marxism and Marxists. Marxists were the apologists for the two greatest atrocities in our lifetime. So you mentioned 7/10, but also 9/11. So I remember 9/11 happening very, very distinctly. I remember leftist apologists talking about American imperialism, they had it coming. So Marxists have been the apologists for the greatest atrocities in our lifetime. Why the hell are you an apologist for Marxism?
Well, the short answer to that is I'm not an apologist for Marxism. I actually don't think these words have much meaning anymore. I don't think the terms left and right really mean anything anymore. As Marshall was saying, I was formerly a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, which, by the way, was a hoot. I enjoyed it very, very much. Made some lifelong friends, had some fun. Wrote for Living Marxism from 1994, actually, not 1997. I've been doing it for a very, very long time. So I guess I started out as a Marxist when I was a kid, when I was very young. I sometimes still call myself a Marxist libertarian, but mainly just to wind people up, because it's kind of an annoying phrase. No one really knows what it means, including me. But I don't think left and right really mean anything anymore. I don't think those are the dividing lines of our time. And the so-called Marxists who defended 9/11 should just, in my view, well, I don't want to tell you what I think should be done to them because I'll probably be arrested for hate speech. They're the scum of the earth, let's put it like that. And I don't know, are they Marxists or not? I don't know. But who cares? No one wants to have a discussion about who's a real Marxist and who's not a real Marxist. That's so 1972. But I do think that left and right are not the important dividing lines anymore. They really aren't. And, sometimes I wake up and I feel really conservative, especially in relation to an issue like education. I just think we have to be so conservative with education. We have to conserve the great knowledge of the past and pass it down to the next generation and stop teaching them all this crap about 72 genders and the history of racism, etc. So I feel very conservative on an issue like that. Other days I wake up and I feel really liberal and I want to defend the rights of gay people to do whatever the hell they want and the rights of people to live their lives free of the intervention of the state or the judgment of the moral majority. I still believe very firmly in that. And then other days I wake up and I feel revolutionary. And I think, why does the House of Lords still exist? I'm going to go down there and start throwing bricks through the window. Or the monarchy. I'm in favour of abolishing the monarchy. As much as I loved Queen Elizabeth II, King Charles III, no thanks. So, even someone like me who comes from that kind of background, I flit all the time between different political creeds, depending on the issue, depending on the mood I'm in. I think the dividing line now is not left and right. It's, are you in favour of humanity or are you not in favour of humanity? And I know that sounds very sweeping, but it really is the fault line of our times. Are you on the side of things that will advance the cause of humankind or are you not? That really is the dividing line. And on 9/11, that dividing line could not have been clearer. If you were on the side of humanity, then you were absolutely against Al-Qaeda. You were absolutely on the side of the people of New York City. you absolutely supported the right of America to respond to this act of apocalyptic barbarism, even if you subsequently criticized the way they enacted that in Afghanistan, etc. So on all of these issues, time and again, the question comes up. On every issue, the trans issue, the Israel issue, the free speech question, do you trust human beings or do you not? Do you like human beings or do you not? And I just find that that is often the fault line of our times, and left and right doesn't really come into it. It's like using, a foreign language to negotiate your way through a country that doesn't speak that language. If you try and use the old divide of left and right to make sense of the 21st century, I think you'll come unstuck quite quickly.
First of all, just to say thanks so much for coming here this evening and for everything you've said. Just a practical question, please, and you've sort of led into this. Given that so many public institutions have been captured by the woke anti-Semitic nexus, for want of a better word, I mean, you probably have a much better turn of phrase for that than I do. How on earth have you managed to push back at these Islamist demonstrations without the police turning on you? Because they're clearly not even-handed. I'm not talking about individual officers. I mean, some of them they're many fair-minded, decent police officers, of course. But as an institution, the police has been much captured by all of this, as every other public institution. Have you managed to do it? It's a remarkable achievement.
Yeah, well, I don't hang around these demonstrations for very long, I have to say. I just go in, swear at people, and then leave quite quickly. Especially when people hold their phones up and start saying, can I ask you some questions? And it's going to end up on the internet and you're like, no, I'm out of here. So I don't hang around there very long. I'm sure if I did, the police would have a word, because as we know, lots of people who've gone onto these demonstrations to criticize Hamas have been arrested by the police, and sometimes violently arrested by the police, for holding up signs saying Hamas are terrorists and so on. So that's probably how I've avoided it. But I agree with the tenor of your question, which is that the police have lost the plot, and they're part of the problem right now. This is how serious the problem is in this current moment. Some of you might remember there was a protest against Israel maybe 2 or 3 weeks after 7th of October, and I did go to that one to observe it. I was there for maybe half an hour, and I felt so physically ill I had to leave, because I literally, with my own eyes and ears, I saw a gang of young Muslim lads chanting for the return of the army of Muhammad to kill Jewish people. I saw that with my own eyes. It's not a myth that these are racist hate marches. But on that march, there was a Hizb Tahrir wing who were chanting for jihad against the Jewish state. Jihad, 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 destroy the Jewish state, something like that. And there were lots of complaints saying this was incitement to violence. And you might remember the Metropolitan Police consulted their Islamic advisor. And he said, actually, the word jihad has many different meanings. Sometimes it means internal struggle and all that kind of. And the police actually put out this policy statement, as if those lunatics in London were, expressing their kind of internal thoughts or their internal struggle, when we all know they were calling for violence against Jews. That's what they were doing. And the police made excuses for them. The police provided them with moral cover. I mean, that's deeply sinister. And if the police had done that in relation to any other ethnic minority, the left would never stop talking about it. But because they did it in relation to Jews, the left don't give a shit, because the left is anti-Semitic. But I've just written a piece about the Maccabi Tel Aviv scandal and the role of West Midlands Police, which I am utterly convinced that West Midlands Police is an institutionally anti-Semitic police force, because they have told us lie after lie about Maccabi Tel Aviv. They have lied about what happened in Amsterdam last November, which was a Jew hunt, and the West Midlands Police have lied about that and covered it up. They've lied about their report justifying the banning of Maccabi Tel Aviv fans from Villa Park last month was full of lies, full of misinformation. And one of the core things they said, which really struck me, is that the West Midlands Police have said on 3 occasions now that in Amsterdam last November, the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans pushed Muslims into a river. Now, not only is that untrue, it's an inversion of the truth. Not only is that factually incorrect, it is an Orwellian hollowing out of what actually happened, which is that a Jew was pushed into a river by a gang of Arab men who said he could only come out of the river when he said free Palestine. So we now have a form of state anti-Semitism. And I don't say this to make people feel depressed or despondent, but just to make us open our eyes. Not only do we have the rabble on the streets and the left and the media, all of whom are horribly Israelophobic, but we now have a species of state anti-Semitism, where you have a police force in this country who are engaging in that kind of moral inversion, which has always been such a core part of the ideology of anti-Semitism. And I think calling that out is so essential to the future health of this country.
I think it's worth picking up on that as well, that the impact on the streets to the Jewish community when misinformation like that is spread is it's unbelievable, because people just pick up on it left, right, and well, the BBC said this, the BBC said that, this is what I saw on Sky TV. And I think, how responsible do you think, not all of the media, granted, but how responsible do you think the media is for the abhorrent increase in anti-Semitism that we've seen?
Hugely responsible. And the BBC plays a massive part in that. The BBC is unquestionably an anti-Semitic organisation. I have absolutely no qualms at all about saying that. If you think about what the BBC has done over the past 2 years, more than 2 years now, every single night on the TV news, it has pumped into people's homes the idea that there's only one war in the world, and it's the worst war that's ever happened. That is literally what they've been saying for 2 years. Constantly. They don't talk about Sudan. They barely talk about Ukraine anymore. They never talk about Sudan because they don't give a damn about African people and there are no Jews involved. They talk about Gaza every single night, and they do it in tones which should suggest that this is the most barbaric war that human beings have ever carried out. That is the message they send. So when I meet people who say to me, I think it's complicated, I'm not sure who the good guy is or the bad guy, I just want to hug those people. Because if you have the ability to withstand that pressure to hate Israel, if you have the ability to withstand that constant messaging from the BBC and others telling you Israel is the worst country in the world, if you have the ability to say, I'm not sure about that, I'm going to think for myself, then you are a special person. And those people are out there, by the way. They're not necessarily on the pro-Israel side, which is where I think people should be, but they are out there, the kind of silent majority who are kind of thinking, I'm not sure about all this crap being pumped into my TV every night by BBC. But yes, the media has played an enormous role in this, and the BBC in particular. If you think about when they broadcast the chant, death, death to the IDF, the Bob Dylan chant at Glastonbury, and everyone says, well, the BBC didn't know it was going to happen. They could have switched that off like that. And I bet you if an actor got on stage and said trans women are men, they would have turn it off. They would have blagged it out instantly. Of course they would have. Or if someone said something racist about black people, they would have turned it off instantly. They let it go out. And apparently all the BBC people at Glastonbury, apparently there were 500 BBC people at Glastonbury, which is what a waste of our money. All those of us who still pay the license fee, which is a dwindling number. But if you think about how they pumped that message into people's homes and then what became of that chant subsequently, people have invaded Jewish-owned restaurants in Australia, harassing the clientele while chanting death, death to the IDF. People have scrawled it on Jewish buildings in the United States. So courtesy of Bob Dylan and the BBC's broadcast of what Bob Dylan said, it's given the worst people in the world a new cover under which to harass the Jews, under which to pursue their hatred of the Jewish people. The BBC is 100% responsible for that.
I just want to follow up on something that you said about the silent majority. I think one thing that we've seen with our volunteers on the streets, and we do a vigil every Tuesday, is there are people that come up to us and will say, we are with you. We've had enough of the hate-filled spit marches. We've had enough of feeling intimidated going into town on a weekend, and we support you. But there's a fear of being identified as a supporter. And it's how we overcome that, or how we give them the reassurance that actually, don't be scared, stand up with us. Any suggestions on what we could do?
I think we have to show people what it means to be like that. So I have a t-shirt that says the word Israel on it, which I wear around London all the time. Not now because it's cold, but when it's warmer I do. I have this hoodie that says the word Zionist on it. That's all it says. It's a black hoodie and it says the word Zionist, which I wear. And you get funny looks, and you get people sometimes kind of coming up to you and stare, and I just say, "Do you have a problem? What's your problem?" A bit more of that. Now, I know it's not wise to do that in every situation, and I know some people are more comfortable doing that than other people are. I get all of that, but I do think we need more of that. We need more of just being so brash. And I think other people will pick up on that and start thinking, well, okay, maybe it's not such a dangerous thing to be pro-Israel. At the moment, it is quite dangerous.
Comes out to blue, white on my nose.
Yeah.
All you discernible.
Yeah.
Gets you your raise there.
It's things like that. It's just kind of bringing it into your everyday life where you are just saying, you know, yeah, I am a Zionist. In the sense that I believe there should exist a Jewish homeland. Yeah, what's your problem? More and more of that, kind of just being a bit more upfront, and language is quite important as well. So I don't now, because I've thought about it early on after 7th of October. I thought very carefully about the language that I was going to use. So I knew I was going to say pogrom. I knew I was always going to refer to Hamas as a neo-fascist army or an army of anti-Semites. I knew I was going to refer to Israel as the Jewish homeland or the Jewish nation. I quite self-consciously started to use all this language, and I still do in everything I write, but I was also using it on TV, radio, because then the person you're up against is suddenly put on the defensive, because you're saying, you know, on 7th of October, an army of anti-Semites attacked the Jewish nation. So you're reframing the narrative from the very get-go. You're not saying Israel was attacked by, you know, whatever, Hamas. You are reframing it to upfront the fact that this was a barbaric attack driven by anti-Semitic hatred, Nazi-style hatred. And that puts the other person on the defensive. And you can see them going on the defensive because suddenly their kind of apologism for that act takes on a different meaning, because they're having to bat back against the accusation from people like me that they are on the side of an army of anti-Semites. So the way we talk, the way we think, what we wear, how we speak, I think all of that can contribute to making other people feel more comfortable about being pro-Israel.
David, we're going to come to you, Paul, in a minute. We'll come back on this side in a second.
Thanks for coming. Really enjoying it. Can I just say that having advocated for Israel for the last 2 years, with many people in this room today, I'm still awaiting my check for the Zionist lobby.
Where is it? Yeah.
I'm disappointed to say I'm still there. I just wondered whether you get accused of this when people find out your views.
Yeah, all the time. I've never received 1 penny from Israel. I'm waiting for the check. I wouldn't take it either, obviously. I get accused of that all the time. And it's so interesting. People will say things like, "I'm not anti-Semitic. I just want to know, are the Jews paying you to say all this?" I got a message on Instagram a few months ago the only social media I use is Instagram. I don't go near X or I'm obviously way too old for TikTok. I don't do any of that stuff. I just use Instagram because it's a nicer environment. And I get horrible messages sometimes. And someone messaging me saying, how much are the Jews paying you to publish all this stuff? And I messaged back saying, sorry, I block racists. I'm going to block you. And he very quickly wrote back saying, I didn't say anything racist. And then he said, I didn't mean Jews. I meant Israel. How much is Israel paying you? And I thought, what a wonderful mask slipping moment. Every now and then they forget to say Zionist and they say Jew, and they're like, oh no, I've let the cat out of the bag. So I get that all the time. Because there are a lot of people out there who genuinely can't understand why someone would be pro-Israel. They're so dumb and they're so kind of addled with that kind of phobic hatred of the Jewish nation that they just can't understand it. I was in Israel a few weeks ago, as I was saying, and it made me more pro-Israel even than I had been previously. Because I tell you what it did, it reminded me of what a nation really should be like. Because this is a nation in which they protect their borders, they take their sovereignty very, very seriously. The young are all healthy and fit, and they carry guns because they're all in the IDF. And you go on the train and you see people with guns flung over their shoulders. They don't need a safe space if someone misgenders them. They don't go crying if someone comes to their campus or their army base and says something they disagree with. The old are safe and the young are brave. The borders are protected. The enemies are defeated. That's what. And I was there thinking, wow, this is amazing. And then I thought, actually, no, this is what all nations should be like. This is what Britain should be like. We should protect our borders. We should defend our sovereignty. We should train our young to be respectful of the nation, to know how to fight for the nation. And we should ensure that our enemies can't come here. This is a perfectly normal thing. But we've lost that, and Israel holds on to it. And it's the great fork in the road that took place after the Second World War, because many people have said this before me. But the message that Europe took from the Second World War is that nationalism is bad. And the message that the Jews took from the Second World War is that nationhood is essential to protect themselves from lunatics in Europe. So that's the great fork in the road. And they've gone over there, we've gone over there. And that's part of the reason there's so much animus, because they remind us of what we used to be like. Confident nations, full of self-belief, full of respectful young people, having a sense of mission and purpose and being comfortable in your own skin. Israel kind of embodies the things that we used to have, and we hate them for doing that. And I think that's part of the issue. But yeah, so I went to Israel, but I didn't get any money, but I did come away thinking, yeah, this is a bloody good country.
I just wanted to question your use of the word fascist. When I discuss Islamism with anyone, I always describe it as the biggest far-right threat in the world since fascism in the 1930s. And I point out the similarities. It's anti the Enlightenment, it's anti-democracy, anti-liberty. It only realizes itself in war, on violent conflict. It takes from the elders of Zion, as the Nazis did, which is inspired by Mein Kampf. But there's also important distinctions as well. The Nazis were ultra-nationalist, while Islamists to anti the nation state. But more importantly, fascism at the time was about smashing the working class. It was about smashing the working class as a potential revolutionary threat to the existing order, whereas Islamism is about imposing their version of Sharia onto the world. So what I wanted to say is that using the term, don't you worry that using the term fascist, that you take away from the specific Islamism of the problem?
I use the word Islamist all the time as well. Flip between the two. And I sometimes even say Islamo-fascist, which is the most controversial term. The Muslim Council of Britain does an annual report on Islamophobia in the media. And I was in it twice, in fact. But once I was in it, I was so proud of this great achievement. Once I was in it because some of you will remember that in Easter Sunday 2019, radical Islamists blew up churches in Sri Lanka. They planted bombs in churches and at Sunday schools and at hotel buffets. They killed around 200 people, maybe more than that. And the Sunday school bombing they did killed, I think, 13 kids, some of whom had to be identified by their dental records. So this was just the vaporization of children who were at the time were reading their Bibles. And I was so angry about that because it's horrific. And I remember being a kid reading my Bible at Roman Catholic school, and I'd been there. And I was on Sky News that evening, and I referred to it as an act of Islamo-fascism. I said, there's no other way we can describe something as depraved as this except as an act of Islamo-fascism. And for saying that, for criticizing these mass murderers of Christian children, I was included in the Muslim Council of Britain's annual report on Islamophobia. So there's an element of danger in using any of these phrases. But I think in relation to, there are historically specific nature of fascism, which I think is important to talk about. But I do think that it captures something of the Islamist threat that other words don't. And I think so long as we don't block out the fact that there is the Islamist contribution, that's really important. We shouldn't let people wriggle out of the fact that there is a problem with radical forms of Islam, with politicized forms of Islam. We should talk about that very frankly and openly. But also, I do think there is a fascistic component to it. And I think although fascists were obviously ultra-nationalists, they also had global aspirations vis-a-vis their conquering of Eastern Europe, their desire to subject Europe to the will of the Nazi regime. So there was that kind of global conquering dynamic to fascism as well. And in relation to the working class, I think Islamism poses an extraordinary threat to working class people. And we saw that after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when trade unionists were crushed and female workers were just instantly decommissioned, and anyone who off the pro-worker left was at great risk of being imprisoned or even killed. You see the same thing in a smaller scale here in the UK. Radical Islamists hate working class people so much. They think, look at the grooming gang scandal. They thought those girls were just white slags, and that's what they call them. They really thought they were the scum of the earth. They have this incredibly imperious contempt for ordinary working class Brits. So it's not necessarily the same dynamic in terms of trying to defeat working class communities as a political force, but it is driven by that same kind of taming desire to kind of keep at bay or tame this kind of section of society who they see as a problem. And they're right to see them as a problem, because the only sections of society in the UK who are willing to talk openly about radical Islam are working class communities. Some of you remember the football Lads Against Terrorism from a few years ago. There was after the London Bridge massacre, where Islamists killed 7 people in London Bridge, there was this huge protest by 200,000 football fans wearing their kits and bringing their kids. Everyone instantly called them far right and Nazis and Tommy Robinson fans and all the rest of it. And they were just ordinary working people expressing their horror at the rise of murderous radical Islam. So there is a real interesting tension, I think, between working class communities and radical Islamist movements. But I think, yeah, there are definitely aspects of fascism that we should keep as a specific definition of events of the 1920s and 30s and 40s. But I think it works for some forms of radical Islam we've seen, and especially for Hamas, because it is so avowedly anti-Semitic. And I think calling them fascists is justified.
Thank you. I've got 2 questions. First is, what do you think about the term Islamophobia? And the second is, I just wondered what you thought about how anti-Semitism has become so mainstream. And it hit me the other day that we've got this Nextdoor app. Do you know about the Nextdoor app? It's an app so we've got in Leeds. So it's all over the country, and it's for communities, for local communities. And people say, does anyone know a joiner? Or, where can I get my car serviced? That sort of thing. Anyway, the other day, this lady put on about how depressed she is with the world and how it's awful that there's a war in Ukraine and with Russia, and how that Israel's committing genocide. And very sadly, oh my God, and very sadly, her husband died, which was an after a comment. But anyway, it was the comments after that was just really, really interesting, that people were saying, yes, you're right, isn't it awful about Israel? It was all about, the comments were all, so sorry about your husband, but you're right about genocide. And it's just how normal that's become. And this is really hard for us to deal with, I think, as Jews.
Yeah, on Islamophobia, I just think it's a bullshit term, completely bullshit. And I do think there's such a thing as anti-Muslim bigotry, and I think that's actually a real problem, and we're seeing a bit more of it growing up in certain European nations. Sometimes I see people talking about Muslims, and I think that is bigoted, that is hateful. There is a racist component to that. There's no question about that. But Islamophobia is an entirely fabricated term. It has its origins amongst the kind of Islamic revolutionaries in Iran and elsewhere who wanted to repackage anti-blasphemy laws in a kind of politically correct way. And you can trace the entire history of that. You can see them doing it through UN councils and UN discussions. Bit by bit, they introduced this idea that Islamophobia is a crime and that everyone should be prevented from criticizing Islam. But Islamophobia is the term that exists entirely to police discussion about religion. And I'm a free speech fanatic. I think we should be able to talk about anything we want, including Islam. We should be allowed to say Muhammad was a pedophile. We should be allowed to say that Islam has some really backward beliefs. we should be allowed to say that the grooming gangs were driven by racial and religious hatred. We should be free to say all of those things. And the clampdown on so-called Islamophobia is about stopping us from doing that. And there's a real danger. Yeah, and well, there's a real danger in the term Islamophobia as well. And Salman Rushdie is a great example, because that's the moment at which you really shift from the old-fashioned idea that you should never criticize Muhammad or you'll go to hell, to this new idea that you should never be Islamophobic or you'll be cast out of polite society.
Fatwa on you, you know, it seems acceptable that they could go for it.
Yeah, and if to see the real danger this can pose, I always think about the Manchester Arena bombing, and the fact, I'm sure some of you have read the report of the inquiry into that, and the most shocking part of it is that on the night itself, when Salman Abedi was walking around with his rucksack, which was so heavy he could hardly carry it because he was a little guy, and the rucksack was full of bombs and material to kill people, so he could barely carry it, and he was walking around the foyer of Manchester Arena at an Ariana Grande concert, mumbling to himself and just walking around and around and around. So the security guard on duty that night thought to himself, I bet that's an Islamic terrorist. And he didn't intervene because he was scared of being called Islamophobic. So the Islamophobia panic is not only irritating and censorious, it's murderous. And we saw the same with the grooming gang scandal, the rape gang scandal. One of the reasons that wasn't confronted by local police forces and councils for so long is that they were worried about being called Islamophobic. So they sacrificed the security and dignity of working class girls at the altar of this great fear of being called Islamophobic. So it's a profoundly poisonous phrase. And the Islamic Human Rights Commission in London, which is an insane organization, they do an award every year, the Islamophobe of the Year, which I was nominated for once, but I didn't win. And I was really proud to be nominated, because I'll tell you why. Guess who they nominated in April 2015? Charlie Hebdo. That was 3 months after the Charlie Hebdo massacre. 3 months, and they nominated Charlie Hebdo, the magazine, for Islamophobe of the Year award. So subsequently, when I was nominated for it, I messaged them saying, I take great pride in this, that you would even think of me in the same breath as Charlie Hebdo, you absolute lunatics. So, Islamophobia is a dangerous idea. And then in relation to everyday anti-Semitism, it's interesting you say that, because I've just been reading Vasily Grossman, the late, great Soviet writer, who in his book Life and Fate, he wrote about anti-Semitism, and he kind of split it into 3 categories. He said there's everyday anti-Semitism, which he said you can kind of live with, although Jews may well disagree with that. And he said there's also kind of political anti-Semitism from the media and left-wing groups and right-wing groups. And then he said there's state anti-Semitism, which is the most dangerous by far, because then you have organized anti-Semitism. And I was reading this because I was writing an essay about Maccabi Tel Aviv, and it struck me that we've kind of got all 3 of those at the moment. We've got everyday anti-Semitism, as you say, and that kind of drip of everyday suspicion of Jews, I think, is really, I'm not as relaxed about it as Vasily Grossman was. We've got that kind of middle anti-Semitism, political media anti-Semitism. We see that all the time. And I think we're starting to see expressions of state anti-Semitism. We've seen it with West Midlands Police, and we've seen it with the BBC, which is the state broadcaster. So it's really worrying. But yeah, that the everyday anti-Semitism, I think, is profoundly problematic. But I that's the kind of thing I mean we should challenge all the time when we see it. It's so important never to let that slide, and just to say it's
Okay, actually, that book you just said, Vasily Grossman, I did buy it recently. I haven't started it yet, but that's because of Douglas, when he quoted, "Tell me what you accuse the Jews of, and I'll tell you what you're guilty of." So that made me buy it. I will start at some point. My question, I don't know if it's a bit silly actually, but for the past couple of years before October the 7th, I've flirted with the idea of visiting Israel, and I always look at flights to Tel Aviv. I know you've just been recently as a journalist. What do you think about people just like me going as a tourist? I mean, should you wait and see what's going to happen? Because I keep thinking I've got to go next year. So there's that. And just another quick question is, what do you think about Tommy Robinson and his visit to Israel recently?
I'm not a big fan of Tommy Robinson, I have to say. People ask me all the time, what do you think about Tommy Robinson? I agree with Melanie Phillips. I agree with her on most things. I think she's amazing. And she's so she doesn't give a shit about anything. She's so forthright. She just says what she wants to say. She was stingingly critical of Israel inviting Tommy Robinson. She said, this is bad for Israel. He's not your guy. Don't do this. And she was incredibly persuasive. I didn't necessarily need persuading because I've always been wary of Tommy Robinson, but I think even to other people, she will have been incredibly persuasive. In relation to going to Israel, absolutely you should go. The most extraordinary, I've been there now 3 times in my life, and I'd like to have gone more. But the most striking thing about when I was there recently, a few weeks ago, is that I felt safer in Israel than I do in London. And I'm not saying this, I'm not Jewish, so I'm not talking about anti-Semitism. I'm just talking about general levels of safety. And the reason I always know when I feel safe in a country is because I can use my phone in public. Now, I don't know what it's like in Leeds, but in London, you can't use your phone in public because it will be stolen. There's no question about that. I've had phone snatchings 3 times. One of them actually managed to get my phone. The other 2 times I said, fuck it, and grabbed it back and managed to keep it. It's a really serious problem. So I always judge a country by whether you can walk around using your phone and feel very comfortable. And in Israel, I was walking and I was saying to my friends, look, I'm using my phone. They thought I was mad. I felt incredibly safe in Israel, more so than I do in London. And I know Jewish friends of mine say the same thing. Melanie Phillips said that on my podcast recently. She said as a Jew, she feels safer in Jerusalem, where she now spends most of her time, than she does in London. She feels, even though Israel is utterly encircled by crazy anti-Semites, she still feels safer there than she does in London, where anti-Semites are just wandering the streets talking nonsense. So go to Israel, 100%. Tel Aviv is great crack. I had such a good time, and people just drink and sit around in squares. It's very cosmopolitan and European. And I got drunk one day. I was visiting lots of people, including Lee Kern, who I love, and various other people. I was hanging out on Tel Aviv beach. And over the course of the day, I was quite drunk. So I went for some chicken wings late at night before I went back to my hotel. And someone burst into the restaurant and said, "Burnt Toast Boy, Brendan O'Neill." And I thought, yeah, okay, I like this country. So absolutely go to Israel, 100%.
It's interesting about the feeling safer in Israel, because it's something that people say to us, to all of us quite often. Why would you want to be there? I say because you know your enemy. Sadly, here you don't know your enemy. It could be anybody, and at least I completely agree with you. Knowing that those around you are more likely to be on your side makes a massive difference. It's 10 past, nearly, it's just after 5 past. We're going to finish about half an hour. I've just got a couple of points I want, a couple of questions, and then we'll hand it out again to the audience. So I know a few people have had their hands up, but we'll get back to you. I mentioned to you that I wanted to ask this question. There's been a lot made up about what you wrote in The Guardian about Farage, and it has not necessarily angered, but people have raised the question. For those that don't know, maybe best if you explain it from your side and what you wrote and what you actually meant, rather than me saying. I think that'd probably be the best way of doing it.
Yeah, I've had so much pushback on this. I wrote about Nigel Farage and the accusations against him having said anti-Semitic things when he was at school. And I think it's a manufactured panic. That's the argument I've made in the roundabout way. I've had so much pushback, not only from the usual suspect, but even from friends of mine and from Jewish friends of mine who they said, "I thought you were so wonderful, and now you've turned out to be a real twat." So I've had all of that. The thing is, the point I would make is and I have made this point in various conversations and speeches, in fact. The point I would make is it's precisely because I take contemporary anti-Semitism so seriously. I mean, I wrote a book about it. It's precisely because I take contemporary anti-Semitism so seriously that I think this scandal is nonsense. because I'll tell you why. It is a distraction tactic by the anti-Semites who run our society. That's genuinely what I believe this is. I don't mean that in a conspiratorial way. I don't think they sat down in a room and said, how can we distract attention from the fact that we're raving racists? It's not conspiratorial. I think there's an instinctive element to it. But when I see The Guardian going hell for leather, The Guardian is behind this scandal about Nigel Farage. When I see The Guardian going hell for leather on what a 13-year-old boy might or might not have said in 1977, when I was 3 years old, when the Sex Pistols were in the charts, when Jim Callahan was in Number 10 Downing Street, Thatcher hadn't even darkened the door of Downing Street, and they're saying, did you hear this 13-year-old boy said the following in the playground in 1977? Elvis Presley was still alive. I just think, hold on, wait, this is the same Guardian newspaper which last year, 2024, had to reprimand 2 of its cartoonists for being anti-Semitic. One of them was sacked because he drew a picture of a Jew with grotesque facial features holding a box of gold coins. The other one wasn't sacked, but he was reprimanded for drawing a picture of Benjamin Netanyahu cutting a pound of flesh from his own stomach. The pound of flesh trope in 2024. This is who we're dealing with. We're dealing with people who have pumped anti-Semitism into the ether for the past 2 years, and obviously much longer than that, who now think they can deflect from that by saying, well, did you hear what this horrible politician said in 1977, 1978, 1979? It's a distraction tactic, and I think the same about the BBC. The BBC did a report on News at 10, the actual News at 10, which lots of people still watch, about Nigel Farage and his school, the allegations against him when he was at Dulwich College. I think this is the first time, if my memory serves me right, that the BBC has talked about anti-Semitism on News at 10. The first time. They didn't say a word when school kids at the Jewish Free School in London, which is close to where I live, were told that they could take off their blazers on their way to and from school after 7th of October so they wouldn't get attacked by anti-Semites. They didn't say a word when a Jewish boy, 14 years old, was attacked on the tube train at Hampstead a couple of months ago and had to be briefly hospitalised. They didn't say a word when a 14-year-old Jewish girl in Stamford Hill had a glass bottle thrown at her by a gang of anti-Semites last year. The only school kid they're interested in when it comes to anti-Semitism is Nigel Farage. The only comments they're interested in relation to school children are from 1977. So I just don't believe them. I don't believe they give a damn about Jews, and I don't believe they give a damn about anti-Semitism. This is a distraction tactic, and the point I would make is, if Nigel Farage said these things, that's very serious. It would have been serious to say Hitler was right in 1977, just as it would be serious if a school kid said it now. And if any of us heard a 13-year-old boy saying that, we would give them a clip round the lug hole, as we used to do you probably can't do that anymore, but we used to do things like that. So it's serious, of course, but it's unprovable. It's ancient history. It happened in a time in which the culture was very different. And the piece I wrote about it, I made the point that on Grange Hill in the 1980s, they used the N-word. When I used to watch it after school with a cup of tea, they were saying the N-word. That's not good. And it's definitely better now that TV shows don't use that word. But that is the culture we lived in. David Bowie in 1976, when he was 29 years old, not 13, he was 29 years old, he said Hitler was a cool guy and maybe we need a fascist leader in the United Kingdom. The Guardian loves David Bowie. And they're absolutely right to love David Bowie. We all love David Bowie. We don't give a damn what he said in 1976 because it was a million years ago and he's since changed his tune. My point is this: we should judge 61-year-old adults by what they do now, not by what they did 50 years ago. And I'll tell you what Nigel Farage does now. He, more than any other politician in this country, pushes back against the scourge of anti-Semitism. He, more than any other politician in this country, has called out those hate marches over the past 2 years. He has said that they were anti-Semitic. He's not pro-Israel enough for my liking, and sometimes he taps into an anti-Israel sentiment, and I think he needs to get a handle on that. But we should judge adults by what they do as adults, not by the stupid stuff they did when they were kids. That's a value of civilization, that you don't judge adults by the mistakes they made when they were boys. Okay?
Hello, Brendan. What is your attitude to the West Bank right-wing settlers who are continuously attacking and harassing the Palestinians?
I think it's really bad. Although I have to say I've become so radicalized over the past 2 years that I don't even say West Bank anymore. I now say Judea and Samaria. I know that's really bad, but I said West Bank in Israel and I almost got lynched. People like, West Bank, what are you talking about? So I don't know what you can say these days. I think there are really bad elements in Judea and Samaria / West Bank. I'm going to just play it cool so I'll appeal to everyone. There are bad elements for sure. And I think some of those settlers are driven by a kind of quite deep animus towards the Arab communities that live around them. Having said that, the focus on those violent acts, the focus on those problematic elements within Jewish communities in that part of the Middle East, it is so disproportionate to what's actually happening. It's so disproportionate in world affairs. And the question I always ask myself is, why do I see coverage of West Bank settlers? I know all of those words are problematic these days, but why do I see coverage of West Bank settlers committing violent acts on the BBC News, but I never see coverage of radical Islamists kidnapping Catholic school kids in Nigeria? Why do I see coverage of West Bank settlers, but I have seen hardly anything on the invasion of refugee camps by radical movements in Sudan and the slaughter of women and children? It's because the BBC is anti-Semitic. So even when you have coverage of an issue that I think is a real issue, and I do think the Israeli government should get a handle on this problem, especially if it thinks that it wants to defend these settlements and say they're not illegal, they are part of the Israeli state, which I think it's perfectly fine for them to say that. But if they want to say that, they need to get a handle on this problem. But again, I just keep coming back to that question. Why do we know more about that than anything else in the world? And God knows what's happening in Southeast Asia or Myanmar or parts of Latin America. All over the world, there are movements that are committing heinous violent acts, far worse than those violent acts, against innocent communities. And we don't hear about it because there are no Jews involved. That's the bottom line. And if anyone else can give me a better explanation for it, I'm all ears. But I have not once heard any convincing explanation for why there is such a disproportionate focus on that. I've been to some of these settled communities in the West Bank. I visited Jewish settlements and so on. They are good people. They profoundly believe that this is a part of Israel. They profoundly believe that Judea and Samaria should be part of Israel. They live in their communities. They rarely venture outside. They are good people. They work. I sat next to this woman and she was from Hendon in London, where the first place I used to go out drinking when I was a kid. These are good people. I think they belong in that part of the world. And I think it's so interesting that people will call Israelis genocidaires and apartheid people and racists, when those same people saying that want to expel every single Jew from the West Bank, just like they expelled every single Jew from Gaza. There are no Jews in Gaza apart from the 1 or 2 dead bodies of Jews that still remain. Every Jew was expelled from Gaza, and it was cheered on by these people who are supposedly anti-apartheid. So we have to continually ask ourselves, even when we're confronted by acts of violence that are really horrible, I think we have to ask ourselves, how has this come about? And why are we being told about this and not everything else? Those critical questions have got to go in our minds all the time.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, basically a few years ago, Barclays Bank said, we want to gift students things, we want to encourage them, and basically banks generally decided that students were the people to really go after. And that demographic was used because they realised that once a student banked with Barclays or Lloyds, they had them for life. Because students are at an age where they take things in, they accept it, and then they go on, but they always believe what they sort of did at university. And here we are with students being taught the most horrific, that literally flipping history, all about how terrible the Jews are, about Gaza. I have a friend who was at university, and the stuff that they are being taught, it is absolutely frightening, never mind all the encampments and everything else that you see outside universities and the threatening behaviour, etc. And I guess my question to you is, how are we gonna change the mind of these students when we know that they're so vulnerable at that age? And what's going to happen to the next generation when they vote? Because it seems to me that Britain's lost.
Yeah, I'm really worried about universities. I mean, I've stopped in accepting invitations to speak at universities recently because I'm too old to be protested against by a bunch of posh 19-year-old kids. Yeah. I'm just not interested in experiencing that anymore. I had it for years, and I thought this is not worth it. Yes, I mean, I would add a few caveats. I agree with what we said, but I would add a few caveats, which I think there's a class element to this. So the higher up the class chain you go, the more anti-Semitic they are. So it's at the Ivy League or Russell Group universities where it's worse. Oxford, Cambridge, Durham. In America, it's Columbia, Yale, Harvard. That's where anti-Semitism really pulsates through the campus and through the activists on campus. If you go to the red bricks universities, which are the medium ones, which have lots of working class kids, you don't see the same thing. And if you go to the former polytechnics, you don't see it at all. So there is an element, I think it's interesting to look at the various dynamics contributing to this, because I am of the opinion, and this has got me in trouble a few times, a lot of the anti-Semitism we're seeing now is both of the Islamist variety, the left-wing variety, and the old aristocratic variety. Because the aristocrats in this country, the upper classes, have always hated Jews. And actually, I'm sorry to say it, if you look at Virginia Woolf or Roald Dahl, I mean, they were bastards, all of them. All that layer of society has always hated Jews. And what's happened through the Israel question is that they've allowed, it's given them a cover to bring that back. There's a reason why Palestine Action was full of posh people. There's a reason why if you went on a Palestine Action demo, you would hear people who sound like Queen Camilla. Just these posh hats, you think, God, where are you from? Because they have given a new lease of life to an ancient hatred through this issue. So that even on university campuses, the class element and the political element plays a role. But I agree with you, there's a real problem. What I find amazing is that these are the university campuses where for the past 20 or 30 years, we've been told that everything is racism. A white fella wearing his hair in cornrows, right? That's racism. That's cultural appropriation. Or, white people wearing saris or eating sushi. I mean, I'm not making this up. For years and years, there was a cancel culture around all issues to do with race. You couldn't express yourself without being called racist. And now, suddenly, at Columbia University, they're saying to Jews, fuck off back to Poland. Yeah. And at campuses in the UK, they're saying that Jews are privileged and problematic. At campuses, I think it was in Leeds, or certainly one of the universities around here, they refer to a rabbi as an animal because he had served in the IDF, or he'd been to Israel. So the people who posed as anti-racist because they kept reprimanding people for wearing the wrong clothes and saying the same wrong things, they are now openly anti-Semitic. They have openly embraced the world's oldest form of racism. So our universities are in big, big trouble. I think the solution is probably to leave them to their own devices for a period of time, limit the number of young kids going to universities, because most of them don't need to go, encourage young people to think about working and learning a trade and contributing to society, and, let the posh people do what they want to do, and just kind of everyone else hold on to your common sense.
Jay,
I'd just like to concur with that. I'm a politics student at the moment. It's problematic, to say the least. What I wanted to ask, actually, we've talked a lot about how things are. How do you see things panning out? We've got this far left, we've got this far right, whichever you want to call it. Who knows what we all are? How are we going to get back to proper conversations, centrist politics? How are we going to right the world? It's probably a question you can't answer, but I'd like to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I think about it a lot. I'm not sure I have the answer to it. I flip between optimism and pessimism. I'm pessimistic because there's still a lot of bigotry around, and the hatred for Israel, I think, is symptomatic of a hatred for the West itself, and that worries me. But I'm optimistic because I think there's a well of common sense out there. There's a well of decency. Most people in this country are decent people. And we can forget that sometimes because the people who make the most noise are idiots and horrible people. And they're very noisy. They have a lot of influence. They have big platforms, but they're not representative of the people in this country. I think most people in this country are still pretty decent. But the question that's been niggling at me since 7th of October is, for how much longer can the silent majority be silent? And if you're still silent after the Heaton Park massacre in Manchester, then we have a problem. And if you're still silent after 7th of October itself, we have a problem. So I do think there comes a time when the lack of people speaking up itself is problematic, and the silent majority idea doesn't work anymore because you want to say, well, where are you? Why are you silent? So that worries me, but I think there is still a lot of common sense and decency in this country. I think in terms of where things go next, it's just, this will sound ridiculous, but it is kind of down to us. It's not pre-written. I'm not someone who believes in fate. I don't think our futures are written for us by gods or books or anyone else. It is kind of down to us, which is really scary. But it is down to more and more people saying more and more things as publicly as possible. That really is the only way these things get swayed. And, it's so you can break the spell of this, but it's just a lot of hard work. And I think the more of us who are out there, and, there are great campaign groups now like Our Fight and Stop the Hate and these kind of counter protests, which I just think are brilliant and hilarious. There is nothing funnier to me than these depressing anti-Semites trudging through the streets of London, and suddenly there's like 100 Jews penned in behind a fence, and non-Jews, kind of singing and dancing and waving the flag and doing that to them. It's so funny. And it really is starting to upset the apple cart to a certain extent. And it's reminding not only the marching idiots, but also the public at large. It's reminding them, there are other people in this country who don't think like that. So the more manifestations of that we can have, the better, because the question of where things go next is actually our responsibility, as scary as that sounds. So we should, do the best that we can.
One name, please, and I'll come around.
I agree with you with what you said on everything apart from Nigel Farage. Now, I voted for Nigel Farage and his party at the last election, so I'm pro Nigel Farage. But at the same time, I was 13 and I experienced the sort of things that Nigel Farage is accused of. And believe me, he might say he's forgotten about it, but when it happens to you, you don't forget about it. And though that guy that was at school with him, I heard him and he was genuine. Now, Nigel Farage may have forgotten about it, but I'm certain that it did happen. And he, instead of denying it, it would have been far better if he apologised and said that he was young at the time and he's learned better.
I don't disagree with that, actually. And I actually completely agree that if Nigel Farage did say these things, he definitely remembers saying it. And I actually think he probably did say some of these things because in some interviews he said, well, if I said things, I didn't mean them in a vindictive way. So he's kind of allowing for the possibility that he said these things. And there is a school report from 1980, I think, which said he shouldn't be made head boy or whatever because he's expressed racist ideas. So there is some proof for them. The thing is, if I was advising Nigel Farage, which I'm not, although apparently the pieces I've written over the past 2 weeks, which everyone hates, have been shared around the reform offices and people are reading them. So I hope it's given them something to think about. But if I was advising Nigel Farage, I would say to him, listen, you should say that you may well have said anti-Semitic things at school and you regret having done that because you were a stupid boy, a very stupid boy who had stupid ideas, and you're sorry for any hurt that you might have caused the other pupils. And then you should say, and I'm happy to talk to these people. Come and talk to me. Let's have it out, and I will say sorry to your face, right? Number one. Number two, he should say, but I will not take lectures on anti-Semitism from the BBC. And I will not take lectures on
did say that.
But I think he did say that, but I think he needs to go harder, because he did say that in relation to the stuff that the BBC was broadcasting in the 70s, which was Alf Garnett and all the rest of it. He needs to go harder on what the BBC is doing now. Right now, as we speak in this room, the BBC is responsible for contributing to one of the worst upsurges in anti-Semitism in our country. He needs to go much, much firmer on that. So I think he should acknowledge that he may well have said these things, and if people were hurt by them, he's very sorry. I think he should offer to meet some of these people. Why not meet them and talk to them? That's usually how things get resolved. And then he should very firmly say, there's a serious anti-Semitism crisis in this country, and it's not down to me, it's down to them. We have to have that moral clarity about where this crisis is coming from.
Stephen. Yeah, thank you very much for coming. It's very interesting. I thought it was going to be the elephant in the room with Tommy Robinson, but then it's been mentioned. But I'd just like to sort of pursue it a little bit more, because I'm told by the BBC to hate him. I'm told by Melody Phillips, who I admire very much, to love him, to hate him. And yet he organised a march where there were 700,000 people. Everybody was accused of being right-wing. But you kind of feel, well, all we're doing is trying to support common sense to some extent, and therefore, should I really hate him? I know your view, but I'd just like to sort of expand maybe. Can a leopard change its spots? Is he just being divisive?
I mean, I don't think you should hate him. He might be a nice guy for all I know. I don't know him from Adam, really. I don't think you should hate anyone unless they've done something really, really, really bad that it makes them worth hating. I just am not convinced that he is the saviour of messed up Britain. That's the point I would make. And in fact, in some ways, I think he contributes to some of the problems that we're facing. That's all I'm saying. I entirely understand where the Tommy Robinson phenomenon comes from. It's because the establishment has been ignoring working class communities for so long and telling them they're gammon and they're stupid and they're racist and they're whatever else they're saying about them. It's precisely because of that disenfranchisement that working class communities are looking for other voices. And millions of them are going for reform. Smaller numbers are thinking, I might follow Tommy Robinson. All of that makes perfect sense to me. No, but he is a political person, and I think it makes sense to me why smaller numbers follow him, larger numbers follow Nigel Farage or want to vote for him. That all makes perfect sense to me. It's the logical dynamic of this kind of classist hatred that we've seen from the establishment over the past 20 years. But the thing is, if you look at that demonstration in London, that's a good example of what I'm talking about. And I'm not here to say F Tommy Robinson, no more than I am here to say follow Tommy Robinson. I'm not into either of those things. People can do whatever they want to do. But that demonstration is a good example of one of the problems I would try to illuminate, which is that the tens of thousands of people who were on that demonstration had perfectly legitimate concerns about the migrant hotels crisis, the lack of control over our borders, the problem of radical Islam. I know people who went on that demonstration, and I know they have perfectly reasonable moral and political beefs with the way society is going. Full of good, decent, honest Brits who just want to wave the flag and have a good country. But then if you look at who was on stage speaking at that demonstration, there were some bad people. There were people who said that there should not be any Muslims in the Western world. I don't agree with that. There were people who were saying that you shouldn't be allowed to read the Quran in Britain. I don't agree with that. I believe in freedom of religion. I believe in freedom of conscience. I believe in equality. So to me, the interesting thing was the contrast between the ordinary people on that demo who had legitimate beliefs and expressed them in a really reasonable way. And I'm sure we could all go for a drink with those people and say, yeah, let's go. And some of the speakers, some of whom were from Europe, who were brought over to speak, and some of those people expressed views that I think are repellent. And I'm just going to put it out there. And they said about Muslims some of the things that I hear people saying about Jews. And I'm not getting behind that any more than I would get behind what people say about Jews. And I think that's the thing that we have to bear in mind, that there is a groundswell of anger in this country about how the country is being run. And it's generally a really positive groundswell of anger. And I think it's going to express itself for the next election. And I'm really excited to see that. But then there are pockets of people who, on the basis of that groundswell of anger, build campaigns that I think are bad and bigoted and not very nice. And our ability to distinguish between the two, I think, is really important.
Okay. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for coming to Leeds this evening. Very, very good to hear you. It's been a good evening. I'm puzzled, and I wonder if you'd say a bit more about the alliance between elements of the far left and Islamists, given that so many of their goals are clearly incompatible, particularly groups like Queers for Palestine and Islamists, and more widely, given the rising presence and influence of a specific kind of Muslim politics in Britain, and bearing in mind that Muslim communities are not monolithic, do you have any thoughts on how, particularly pro-Israel campaigners, to use a shorthand, could engage with Muslim communities in the effort to initiate some kind of dialogue? Is there any way forward there?
Yeah, good, really good questions. I think the Islamo left is just bananas. It's so surreal to me. And I think Queers for Palestine is a really good example of that. And in fact, one of the points I make in my book is that if any of these queers went to Palestine, their pronouns would be was, were very, very quickly. It's crazy. It's a suicidal movement. It is a suicidal movement where they are aligning with their own gravediggers. That's essentially what is happening. And we've seen it before. We saw it with the Iranian Revolution, where the left threw its weight behind the Islamic Revolution because they wanted to get rid of the Shah. And they wanted to get rid of the Shah for good reasons. He was becoming an increasingly tyrannical leader who was restricting political freedom and so on. They threw their weight behind the Ayatollah and his army of Islamists. And then, lo and behold, the Islamists won and the left was screwed.
Now they want the Shah.
They were, some of them do want the Shah back. They were imprisoned, they were executed, women were turned into second-class citizens, and the rest is history, as they say. So, yeah, the Islamo left is bizarre. I think it's an outgrowth of the fact, I think the most important development in British politics over the past 50 years, really, has been the left's abandonment of the working class. They have turned their backs on the working class to a staggering degree, to such an extent that they actually hate the working classes now. You can see it when they use terms like gammon to refer to working class voters. Gammon is pygmy. They're calling them pigs. And I hear leftists use that term all the time. They have such hatred and contempt for working class communities. And that hatred and contempt will grow because so many working class voters want to vote for Nigel Farage for reform and so on. So yeah, the Islamo left is, I think, a case of the left looking for new alliances because it's lost the working class and it's lost its footing in society. And it's created this alliance with a bunch of lunatics. I think in relation to, what was your second question again?
Dialogue with Muslims.
Oh, yes, that's exactly, I think that's really important. I couldn't agree more that the idea of a monolithic British Muslim or a monolithic Muslim community is nonsense. I mean, I see that in London. When I go around London, the idea that there is such a thing as a Muslim is just actually not true, because you can go to Selfridges and you see these painfully rich Arab men and women who are rolling in the kind of money you and I could only dream of, buying crap they don't even need and living it up and eating chocolate, and they're all fat. They are incredibly decadent and rich, and I think a little bit crass, in my view. But then you go to East London and you see Bangladeshi communities who are dirt poor and struggling. And the women often wear the face coverings because they're forced to by men. And their lives are really, really bad quality lives. These women who live in very poor conditions in the East End of London and they can't even see where they're going in the street. So the idea that these are the same people is preposterous. And there are many other different, you go to parts of London, you see Turkish communities where the food is great and they're normal people and they wear normal clothes and they talk about politics. There are all sorts of different Muslims in this country. And I think that's really important to remember. And there are Muslims in this country who don't have truck with radical Islam. And one of the problems with a term like Islamophobia is precisely that it punishes Muslims as well as non-Muslims. Because if you're a Muslim and you raise any questions about Islam, God help you, if you leave Islam and become an apostate, you will be attacked, you will be sometimes violently attacked, you will be isolated. There are a lot of sensible Muslims out there and ex-Muslims, both, who I think we could have really reasonable conversations with about the importance of supporting Israel, the importance of supporting the West. I have conversations with people like that all the time. And I think it's really important to do that wherever we can.
Brilliant. I'm going to have to apologise. I know there were other people that wanted to ask questions, but we've really run out of time. I just want to ask you before we finish, Brendan, what do you want to see in 5 years' time, and what do you expect to see in 5 years' time?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, maybe invite me back in 5 years and see how things are going. I think, good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's hard to predict. If you had told me in 2012 that in 4 years' time we'd vote to leave the EU, I would have struggled to believe you. But we did. I was one of those people. I will die on the hill of Brexit. I think it's the best thing that's ever happened in this country, and it's too late now for you to ask questions in response to that. So yes, I would have struggled to believe that was possible, but it happened. It happened. Who knows how that happened, but it came about. I think in 5 years' time, where I think things will be, is that I think we'll have a new government. I think it will probably be a Reform/Tory government or a Reform/DUP government. I'm not sure Reform will get all the votes they need. I think they'll do a good job on some things and a bad job on other things. I think one of the problems with Reform is that they don't have a history of running affairs in this country, whereas Labour and the Conservatives do. They've been in power for 150 years between them. They do a bad job of it, but they know how things work, or they should do, where Reform doesn't. So I think Reform will be a haphazard government. We'll get some things right and some things wrong. But I think the positive thing is I think wokeness is on the way out. And in fact, I have a new book out called Vibe Shift, which is published in January, although you can get a copy before anyone else on earth by making a donation to Spike's Christmas Fund Prize. You could be one of the first people to get a copy of Vibe Shift.
Is that what they call a plug?
Yeah, that's a plug. I didn't even plan that. It just kind of popped into my mind. And Vibe Shift is about the democratic revolts we've seen over the past few years against wokeness. And I argue in the book that we are living through the twilight of luxury beliefs. Luxury beliefs are on their last legs. The idea that a man can become a woman. The idea that the world is going to end in 2035 if you don't recycle your rubbish. The idea that it's racist to wave the flag of Britain. All of these ideas, which have been core luxury beliefs of the establishment, are on their way out. And they're on their way out because ordinary people said bollocks. They said, no, a man can't become a woman. No, the world's not going to end. And yes, you can wave your flag. And I think that's the trajectory I'm most interested in. There's one luxury belief yet to fall, which is Israelophobia. And it's down to everyone in this room to make sure that's the next luxury belief to really hit the shit heap of history.
And I think that is probably the best. Thank you very much.